So today I want to react to a video Sam Harris put out on his main channel. It's a video essay called Intellectual Authority and Its Discontents. I listened to it yesterday and there was a few things I wanted to push back on, which he said.
Our institutions simply must regain public trust. The question is, how can they do that? At the core of this problem lurks a fundamental question about the nature of intellectual authority.
In the video, he's talking about intellectual authority. He's kind of making a case for how more respect for intellectual authority is better than less. And he's lamenting how a lot of the mismanagement of COVID lockdowns and responses has led to a lot of distrust for experts. I disagree with him on a few points. I think obviously too much distrust for experts is a problem, but I think in general too much trust in authority figures leads to worse outcomes than a little bit of skepticism.
When do we rely on it? And when are we right to ignore it, or even repudiate it? Everyone knows that you shouldn't argue from authority. You can't say, what I'm saying is true because I am saying it, or it's true because Einstein said it, or because it's been published in a prestigious journal. Okay, if a theory is true, or a fact is really a fact, it is so independent of the identity of the person adducing it. Consequently, no sane expert ever really argues from authority. What actually happens is something that is easily mistaken for this, which is that people often rely on authority as a proxy for explaining or even understanding why something is true.
He makes a nice point about how, in general, what people are doing, especially when they're doing it right, is they're not arguing from authority, which is a known logical fallacy. They're using authority as a proxy. So the word I'd use here is a heuristic, which I use to mean a way of, an approximation of a truth-finding method. So, if you're using something as a heuristic, it kind of is accurate a lot of the time, but there's not actually necessarily a direct relationship between the heuristic and the thing that you're finding to be true. I should probably give an example for that, but I haven't got one right now. But yeah, this idea of expertise as a proxy is well stated by him, I think.
It's a little like using money as a medium of exchange, rather than hauling around valuable objects or commodities. It's easier to carry dirty paper in your pocket than a barrel of oil or a bushel of wheat. In the same way, it's easier to say or to think that gravity is identical to the curvature of space-time because Einstein proved it, than it is to really understand the general theory of relativity. It's a shortcut that's necessary for just about everyone most of the time. The crucial point is that there is a difference between rejecting any argument from authority and rejecting the value or reality of authority itself. For instance, I often speak with physicists on this podcast, and when I do, it is appropriate for me to assume that they know their field better than I do. After all, that is what specialization is.
Where I disagree with Sam Harris is, yeah, sure, if we had to do research, if everyone was just completely skeptical about everything and wanted to research every little point that experts figured out and wanted to share their knowledge of with the public, then it would just be way too cumbersome. Everyone would spend all their time researching, and even then they wouldn't accept most of the things experts had come to know. So we do need to have a certain amount of trust in experts in order to benefit from their knowledge and in order to have a productive society. But there are cases when there are financial incentives for companies and even people in government to misrepresent science on things. And there are cases where doubts about the research methodologies can be raised. So, if you just say, experts in this field from this university have determined this through this study, sure, the default should be to think, yeah, that's probably true. But when it's the case and it's like that there's also an industry with financial incentives to convince people of the conclusion that study found, and when we look at the study methodologies, we find questionable things going on, then that goes out the window, and we should actually scrutinize what's going on here, both by following the money and by scrutinizing their research methodologies. And there's value in doing that in cases where the stakes are high.
If I spent as much time studying physics as a professional physicist and proved competent at that task, I would be a physicist. And when talking to a physicist, it is important for me to understand that I'm not one. Of course, this is true for any other area of specialization. If I'm talking to Siddhartha Mukherjee about cancer, it is only decent and sane for me to acknowledge, if merely tacitly by asking questions and listening to the answers, that he, being a celebrated oncologist, knows more about cancer than I do. There simply is such a thing as expertise, and to not acknowledge this is just idiotic. And to move through life not acknowledging it is to turn the whole world into a theater of potential embarrassment. Relying on authority can produce errors, of course, in the same way that some of the money in your wallet could prove to be counterfeit, but not relying on it, shunning it, just, quote, doing one's own research, is guaranteed to produce more errors, at least in the aggregate.
Yeah, so he admits that relying on expertise can produce errors, but what's the safety net that we have in order to catch those errors when they happen? I just described one. Sam Harris does not give one.
Of course, I'm not denying that it's possible to do truly original research, where you become the new authority, but that is not what we're talking about here. Doing one's own research almost never entails running the relevant experiments in virology oneself, or searching the Soviet archives oneself, or translating the speech from Arabic oneself, or interviewing the long-dead politician oneself. Most of the time, we simply have to trust that other people did their work responsibly.
He makes a really silly point here about how doing your own research doesn't involve actually carrying out, for example, a vaccine trial. The expertise required to actually execute a medical trial on a drug, for example, that's something I believe you need to go to university to get training on. But to read the commentary from one expert or the replies from another expert as to the conclusions that we can derive from that study, I think a layman can do if they're intelligent and they understand a lot of the relevant principles of physics and principles of research and so on. And to say they can't is gaslighting.
That their data isn't fabricated, that they didn't devote their entire careers to perpetrating an elaborate hoax. Again, there are exceptions, but they are simply not relevant most of the time. That is what it means to be an exception. Most of the time, if you no longer trust the experts, you've started trusting someone's uncle. Most of the time, real experts who have been trained in the relevant disciplines through real institutions offer the best approximation of our knowledge within a field. This is no more debatable than the claim that most of the time our best basketball players are in the NBA.
So he's saying here that most of the time the experts are right. Yeah, even if we grant that they're true most of the time, even if we want to say 99%. My question to him is, what's the method used in order to catch them when they are wrong? He's not presenting one. He's sort of just making a case for more or less blind trust. And when somebody does raise concerns, legitimate concerns of why we shouldn't trust these particular experts on this particular issue, his reply is, oh, but they're right most of the time. It's like, okay, but are they right this time on this, given that we have these reasons to doubt them? He gives this example about a basketball team, how, sure, it's possible that you could find one of the best basketball players in some random place, but chances are the places where you're going to find the best basketball players are on a basketball team, on one of the basketball teams, and they would have already been found to be competing.
The fraud who originally linked the MMR vaccine with autism is considered an unfairly maligned scientific authority. If Fauci and Collins, or any other scientists, are guilty of scientific misconduct.
His next point is about how RFK Jr. Trumpets this theory that from one study, I can't remember the name, about that supposedly linked to And maybe that study's been debunked, but what hasn't been done is robust research in order to see whether a link does exist or not, as I was saying earlier, to really rule out a connection between and we need to follow children that have received no and compare them to children who have. The argument against that kind of study is, oh, well, we can't research it because if we did research it, we'd be harming children by depriving them of that we know are beneficial. And the response to that is, well, how do you know they're beneficial if you've never actually done the study? You know, it's similar things happen with the COVID. That so much lies were told about that in order to get people to take them, because there was this belief that they did more good than harm, that they were the savior. But they didn't actually know that was true because they didn't do the research, and they covered up some of the counter evidence to that point. And a lot of harm was done by people crusading in this way. That belief that this thing is such a good that we need to tell lies in order to get people to take it is super harmful. And it's the same kind of religious fanaticism that we see from like Muslim extremists and, you know, religious extremists of all variety who want to kill people who are preaching a different religion because they're going to save them from going to hell by saving them from believing the wrong religion. It's super crazy stuff, and we don't want to have that sort of thing in our meaning making around medical practice either. If it is the case that these are a huge savior, then it will be proven so by doing the actual research.
What's more, it's been damaging to the public conversation about several important issues. However, I'm probably guilty of making some bad calls myself, and I will probably make mistakes in the future. But these are edge cases for a reason. They're hard to figure out. My general policy is that the most respected, mainstream voices on most topics are generally worth listening to. Again, in many fields, on many topics, it's like finding your next free throw shooter in the NBA. Right? Not a bad place to look.
Yeah, again, he's saying that he thinks most intellectuals are right most of the time. So if we just believe mainstream points of view on everything, we're more likely to be right than if we actually think about things for ourselves. Then he gives the example again of, if you want to find a really good basketball player, the chances are you're going to find them on an elite basketball team, not anywhere else. But that analogy doesn't carry over because, like I said, an intellectual can be wrong and get away with it because they're not going to lose a basketball game if they're wrong. They're going to have, enough people listen to Sam Harris, then we might never find out if they're wrong, or we might find out if they're wrong decades later when a lot of damage has been done from people believing the thing they were saying. What we need to do is hold experts accountable to the relevant epistemologies of their industry. So if somebody's a medical researcher, they need to be held accountable to the research methodologies and the evidence and the logical connections that you can draw based on the results of that evidence.
Thanks for the view. This is a new channel I'm starting up where I'll be commenting on politics, economics, and social issues. So if you like this sort of stuff, be sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.